Hey, it is Zennial Gamer here today to talk about ruining all your monsters. All the monsters you got. Today, guys, we're going to be talking about what do you do when you've got a new toy or an old toy you haven't used in a while. You're not sure exactly how to ruin it and you want to figure out the target stats. Now, today's video is kind of like a follow-up to a video I did about a month ago talking about crit rate, accuracy, and resistance runes. Those runes are runes that a lot of us have sold for a long time, and especially in the current meta, since artifacts, they are really, really useful now. And I think a lot of us are still in the habit of selling them. I will tell you, even slot 4 attack runes have some value now. So, just as a quick demonstration, this was actually done in the optimizer on stream a couple of days ago. I ran a build to see which build I had that would do the most damage for Poseidon. I assumed it would either be a crit damage or a crit rate, slot 4. I wanted to move him from Despair, like Focus or something random, to Despair Will for Arena Rush. And so I ran it through the optimizer, and I was shocked to see that the optimizer told me to use a slot 4 attack rune. So, I said, let's do a damage test. We tested his damage in his current build. He hit for about 21,000 a hit. We put him in this slot 4 attack rune, and boom, he hit for 26,000 a hit. Now, before we go further, and I am going to be talking about how you figure out a monster's base stats, but the first thing that we need to understand is how damage is actually calculated, and why the best build that I had for Poseidon was a slot 4 attack and not a slot 4 crit damage. So every monster in the game has a multiplier on each of their skills. Typically that multiplier is going to be a certain percentage of attack. So just for easy numbers, let's say 500% of attack. In some cases it's higher or it's lower. But for easy numbers, we're going to say it's 500% of attack. So we're going to pull our super high quality Windows 10 calculator up here. And we are going to look at our Poseidon, and we're going to say that in his current build he has 790 attack. But remember, you also have your arena towers. So again, we just want to keep this with really easy math. Let's just say the arena tower is 20% attack. Let's not worry about attack leads. Remember, you could have attack leaders and so forth, but we're just going to take our arena tower. So it's actually 790 times 1.2, not plus. So we're going to take 790 times 1.2, and we have 948 base attack. Now on top of that, we have 1,860 additional attack from our equipment. So if his multiplier were 500%, it's pretty straightforward. We just multiply that by 5, and we're going to do 14,000 damage. So now we know our base damage. The next step is to figure out, did we get a critical hit? And if so, we're going to add in that crit damage. Now in this case, I have 62% crit damage. It's very, very low, but we're going to go times 1.62 on our screen, and that gives us our total damage, 22,744. Now, this is a simplified formula, guys. Obviously, there's additional damage from skill ups and things like that, but I just want to demonstrate kind of like the easiest way. So our Poseidon is going to do about 22,800, 700 damage before any enemy defense adjustment. So if the enemy has high defense, that's going to lower our damage. We're going to get additional damage through skill ups and things like that. Now, through most of Summoner's War history, most monsters really worked on that exact formula that I just showed you, and that meant that you needed to have a balance between attack and crit damage, which means that crit damage slot 4 was usually the highest damage output, and it still is. Don't get me wrong, crit damage is almost always still going to be the highest output, assuming you can make all of the other stats. But over time, Summoner's War has introduced scaling damages. So for example, when Poseidon got buffed, he got speed scaling damage, meaning that his damage increases proportionate to his attack speed. Why is Vigor so amazing? Vigor is amazing because he has HP scaling damage. Bruisers like Ritesh have HP scaling damage. Fang has defense scaling damage. So all of these monsters that now scale to stats other than attack also benefit from those other stats, so that you can give a monster like Vigor, for example, slot 4 HP, and his damage increases at the same time that his tankiness increases. Now, his damage does not increase as much as it would if you gave him a crit damage rune, but it increases maybe half as much, just for argument's sake. Or actually, in the case of Vigor, it's probably more like 75% as much. So you can do 75% as much damage, but also be super tanky. And that's kind of what brought on the Bruiser meta, which came before the reset meta. So when we think about the fact that our monsters can now scale off of a lot of things, it makes the whole damage equation that much more complicated. And that's why, if you guys have seen me run damage builds in the optimizer, And we're going to go ahead and pull the optimizer up here real quick. If you've ever seen me run a build for a monster, usually when I'm figuring out how to rune my monster, I actually include the amount of damage that they'll do, the actual amount of damage in a simulated real game situation. So for example, just using this Poseidon again, when I wanted to see how much damage he would do on his Maelstrom, I went into the optimizer, I pulled up Maelstrom, and you can see right here, speed 350, so this is showing that it scales to speed. And then I asked what was the average attack. So the average is like you take all the damage that he does on crits and all the damage that he does on non-crits, you add it together and divide up. Find out the average attack. I said the average enemy defense would be about 1200, but I would have an attack buff and a defense break. I was max skill ups, and when I put all of this into the optimizer, it tells me the real damage that he does. Now in the case of my Poseidon, I also wanted him to be on Despair Will. And the only thing I told the optimizer was to put in a speed slot 2, and I just let it pick the other runes for me. This is something you can't really do unless you have the Optimizer Pro, because there would be way too many options for the optimizer to figure out. So if you're on the free version, you might want to go attack, crit rate, crit damage, attack, something like this, just to narrow it down a little bit. Now, in the case of being on the Optimizer Pro, you can run virtually every single build available. I max out the search depth, I don't use a focus, I run like every single build from every monster I have, and then when I run all of these builds, we can just sort by damage, and we can see what our highest damage dealing build is right here. Now, this is based off runes and inventory. My highest damage dealing build was with crit damage, but once I told it to also include locked monster runes, it spat out this slot 4 attack. Now, part of the reason that it did that is because obviously we need to make certain other stats, and that's ultimately what we're driving to on this video. How do you know the totality, all of the different stats that you need? So in the case of my Poseidon, I needed him to be at least 230 speed to speed tune with the comp that I was using. I obviously wanted him at least 85 crit rate, and then I wanted him to be at least, I think I put it in for about 35 accuracy, figuring I'd get another 20 accuracy off the artifact. Really, anything under 50 accuracy for Poseidon is kind of rough, but since he was being built primarily as a damage dealer, I was willing to go a little bit lower. Now, you guys get the idea of how we can calculate damage, but how do we know what we're actually looking for? Well, first things first, when you get a monster, you want to figure out, obviously, and this is going to sound like basic stuff, guys, bear with me just a moment because it's all part of a process, right? When you get a monster, you want to figure out what it does, what it scales off of, and ultimately how you're going to use it. So I think Cocky is actually a really good example here. When Cocky came into the game, and part of the reason he got nerfed, something I may not agree with, but that he should have been nerfed, but part of the reason he did get nerfed is because his passive right here said increases your defense by 20% of your attack power when the battle begins. Now, when he came into the game, it was by 50%. And then inflicts additional damage proportional to your defense when you attack on your turn. So what was happening is that he came into the game, and I think Com2Us just assumed that everybody would build him on like triple attack, and people actually were building him on like double defense attack, and then allowing him to do just to be insanely tanky on those defense runes while still doing an incredible amount of damage because he was getting that defense scaling damage. So that was the situation of somebody looking at a monster and saying, how can I make this monster as good as it can be? Well, this monster could be put on lots of attack and it could hit for 100,000 damage, but 100,000 damage is unnecessary. 40,000 damage will kill almost everything I'm facing. 50,000, 60,000 damage will kill everything I'm facing. So why not make it so that this monster is super tanky and still kills almost everything? Like, we don't need to overkill, we just need to kill. So somebody went out and they tried him out on a couple of defense runes. Then we went out and used him, and we're like, oh wait a second, this guy can also do a ton of damage with his skill 1 if he lands the defense break, so we got to get him some accuracy. What do we not need? We don't need crit rate and crit damage. Anytime you look at any monster, you want to break it down in terms of which stats will benefit the monster most, which stats will benefit the monster the next most, and which stats don't matter at all. So let me give you another good example. A lot of you may know that I pulled Pontos in February. So let's take a quick look at Pontos right here. Alright, well if you go look up Pontos' multipliers, you'll see that they're garbage. Like, he can't do damage. Even if I set him up and wanted to use him as a damage dealer, I couldn't get him to do damage. Kind of the same thing as Triton, right? Like, you could just put him in the heaviest damage dealing build possible, and yeah, he would actually do a little bit. Like, if you put a defense breaker in front of him, it's not like he'd do 0. If I put him in just like my heaviest rage set, maybe he'd hit for 15 or 20k. But in the meantime, this monster that is like incredibly powerful, gives my team invincibility and cleansing and silence and all this stuff, would be in a rune set that just made no sense for him. I wouldn't be taking advantage of this really high base HP, and I'd be putting in lots and lots of attack sets, like attack percentage stats on this incredibly low attack, so it wouldn't scale as well as it does on another monster. So that's another thing that you want to look at, by the way, is the base stats. So Pontos here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 base HP. That means that if I put a slot 6 HP rune on him, I'm getting 63% of 12,000 HP. I'm adding almost 7,000 HP to him. Whereas if I were to put a slot 6 HP on my Kaki, I'm only getting 63% of 8,400. I'm only adding 4,000 HP to him. And the opposite is true with attack. If I put a slot 6 attack on Kaki, I get a lot more attack than if I put a slot 6 attack on Poseidon. So, because all of the stats that we get off of our runes, or at least most of the stats that we get off of our runes, are going to scale our base stats, the higher areas of base stats on a monster are usually the areas that you want to emphasize. Now, there are some exceptions. One possible exception, and this still kind of remains to be seen, he's obviously just newly buffed, but a monster like Carcino, who is really an attack type and has a really high base attack, I actually see him as more of a bruiser type because of the glancing on his passive, and because of the fact that he defense breaks on his passive as well. So there are going to be some exceptions, and those exceptions largely have to do with how you envision yourself using the monster. But we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But let's go back for right now to Pontos, and talk a little bit more about how you would build a Pontos. Well, we know that we can't really give him that much attack, so remember, thinking back to our equation, a monster that scales on 500% attack, if they have less attack number, then they do less damage, and even if they have lots of crit damage, you're multiplying a lower number by that crit damage, so they do less damage. We also know that we usually want Pontos to go first on our team because he has the ability to cleanse and give us immunity. And so if he's going first, then we're not going to be facing that many defense breaks, and we're not going to have him attack buff, so it just doesn't make a lot of sense to build him as a damage dealer. In that case, we want to make him as tanky as possible, but if you have relatively efficient runes and you're later in the game, then you're probably going to want to give him a lot of resistance as well. Now, the build you see right here, this is my in-game build for Pontos. This is not my RTA build. In my RTA build, I'm actually max resistance and I'm 64 accuracy. I actually have Pontos in HP accuracy, I believe, with max resistance through subs. So, the next thing we want to talk about is what can Pontos do? Like his turn 3, or excuse me, his skill 3 is an AoE cleanse, and it's an AoE invincibility. And you can use it once every 4 turns, and it lasts for 2. So what does he do in the other 3 turns? Well, the only other thing he really does is this AoE silence. So if he does not hit this AoE silence, then he's dead pick for those 3 turns. Kind of the same thing as Chiwu. Chiwu really only has one primary function, and which being the AoE strip and pushback, and then a lesser secondary function. The difference is that with Chiwu, if Chiwu's going a second time, a lot of times you've lost the fight already, whereas Pontos is really a monster that's designed for a longer fight. So if he's meant for a longer fight, I'm going to be using that skill 2 a lot. I really want to have the accuracy for it. So the build you see on screen right now, again, this is he's not in a build that I use very often. Mostly I use him for RTA, so the RTA build has much higher quality runes, and that's where I've got the heavy accuracy. Now, I would say the majority of the monsters in the game, it's going to be fairly straightforward. If you look at a monster like Daphnis, we know that Daphnis needs to be in a straight-up nuker build. Daphnis needs lots of attack, lots of crit damage, 80 to 85 crit rate. I want to say 85, but mine doesn't have 85, so I can't. But he should have 85. Again, if I used him in RTA, he would be 85. If I used him much, honestly, if I used him much anywhere, he would be 85. And then he should have at least 50% accuracy, preferably more, especially now that you can get accuracy through artifacts. Daphnis should also be in a very fast build, but he should act behind an attack buffer most of the time, so you want him to oftentimes be the second fastest monster on your team, and you want to speed tune him either to like a really fast Fran, or speed tune him to something like a Bastet or an attack bar booster that also gives you an attack buff. So a monster like Daphnis, very straightforward. A monster like Bastet, even more straightforward. There's only two ways to build her. You put her in Swift, whatever, and you just make her your fastest attack bar booster. You would use that for arena offense and for other offenses. Or you put her in a violent will resistance build that you would use on some siege defenses. And there's really not a lot of other ways to build Bastet, because her function is basically attack bar boosting and debuffing. She just needs, again, to be fast with accuracy. And then where do you put those other stats? You make her tanky and you put her in resistance. But then there are some monsters that are a lot more complicated. So Ciara comes to mind as a monster that can be built in like 70 different ways. I mean, seriously, you can build Ciara in so many different ways, and she's good in all of them, right? Because her skill 1 allows you to turn cycle, so you're going to gain attack bar every time you land a critical hit. So if you want to do a turn cycling Ciara, then you're going to need at least 85 crit rate. On the other hand, she can bomb and she can kill monsters of any attribute, because you can land a bomb on any attribute and it's not a big deal. So if that's the case, then you need tons and tons of attack, but you also need really high accuracy. Now again, this is where artifacts kind of come into play, because you can get some extra accuracy off your artifacts, and also you can get some additional damage off your artifacts. So a monster like Ciara, if you're playing her to turn cycle, you want all these additional damage by X's on her artifacts right here, additional damage by X's, so that when she does her skill 1, which she's doing very frequently because she's attack bar boosting herself, she's doing all that ignore defense damage. But ultimately, Ciara can also be built as a tanky monster, because a lot of times people are going to target her first. So you can build Ciara on Violent, and then you can have her on Speed, Crit Rate, Attack. You can put her on Speed, Crit Rate, HP. A lot of people will have Ciara acting last on their team because she needs a stripper in front of her. She doesn't strip for herself, so you might put her on HP Crit Rate Attack, or HP. You guys get the idea. She can be built a lot of ways. When it comes to a monster like Ciara that's flexible, what's more important than figuring out which runes you want to put on her is figuring out which stats will fit best in your team. So instead of saying, oh great, I've got Ciara, I'm going to build her, say, oh great, I've got Ciara, I'm going to run her with monsters X, Y, and Z. Maybe you're going to run her with a Vertihile and a Lauren for crazy turn cycling. And if that's the case, just the fact that you know that you're trying to turn cycle already tells you that you're going to be in a crit rate build. It also tells you that you're not going to be in the highest damage builds where you're trying to cleave out. So you know that you're going to want her a little tankier. Maybe you're like, I'm going to run her with Bastet and Odin for arena offense. That's one I used to run. In that case, now we know we've got an attack bar booster. We probably want to add some, an attack power booster. We probably want to add some extra damage to make sure that the bomb that she lays out kills. We may be less worried about crit rate at that point because we figure we're going to cleave everything out. Maybe you want to run her as a wind tank so that you can bring her in against Pernas because she can bomb those same Pernas, but rather than planning to detonate, you're just going to keep laying bombs to keep the Perna stunned. In that case, you want her super tanky, but with high crit rate. So ultimately, you want to figure out how you're going to use her, and then you're going to target your stats for those usages. Now, another great example of this would be a monster like Praha. Praha you can use in Violent, and she's amazing. You run her... The reason she's amazing in Violent is because you can do an AoE strip into an AoE sleep. But you can also put her in Despair because you can AoE strip into stun. In both cases, you're kind of running some RNG-based luck. The AoE strip is an 80% activation rate, so there's a little bit of RNG there to begin with. And then on top of that, you know, if you're going for a Despair stun, it's 25% of the time. If you're going for the Violent proc into AoE sleep, it's 22% of the time. You still have to land accuracy checks on the sleep. So either way, you're picking kind of an RNG-based build, but the Violent does have the added advantage of allowing you to cycle back to your skills, whereas the Despair allows you to kind of gain a little bit more control by those occasional turn 1 stuns. The old style build of Praha, or the arena defense style build of Praha, Nemesis, this is because Praha has a resistance lead. So you see I've got the 61 resistance with the Praha resistance lead. And in that case, you're trying to basically say, okay, I've got max resistance, monsters can't debuff me as much, and when they hit me, they're going to proc my Nemesis, and I'm going to get to do an AoE heal. But you'll also see a lot of Prahas run on Revenge. And as a matter of fact, these days you might see some of them run on even triple Revenge. because of the turn cycling from the skill 1. So again, there's not like one mandatory way to build. You can go Violent Revenge or Nemesis, you can go Despair Revenge or Nemesis, you can go Triple Revenge. And each of these is a different type of design. Are you designing your Praha to cut the enemy's Lucian, basically, in which case my Praha's too squishy. You wouldn't have a slot 4 crit rate, you would have a slot 4 HP rune. Are you building your Praha to be used on offense? Are you building her to be used on defense? So the idea here is basically, because you have a monster that can be built a lot of ways, you want to think forward to where you're going to use it, who you're going to use it with, and how you're going to use it. And let those decisions kind of dictate the stats that you're looking for. Now, once you know how you're going to use the monster, the next thing to know is what are its multipliers. And this is really simple, guys. If you go into Google and literally just type in the letters SW for Summoner's War, and then the monster's name, so I could do SW Praha, there's a dozen different websites that are going to pop up that will tell you the different multipliers of the monster. You can also pull them right up in the optimizer if you use them. So in this case, I could come over here to damage options. I could pull up my Praha, and I can see skill 1 is 130% of attack. Skill 3, obviously, no multiplier because it's just a heal. Skill 2 is 300% of attack. If I pull up a monster like Ritesh, for example, and we pull up his Trick of the Wind, we see it's just straight up 30% of HP. There's no attack multiplier in this at all. But don't be tricked, no pun intended on Trick of the Wind. So a monster like Ritesh scales completely to HP, but other HP scaling monsters, for example Vigor, are going to scale to both HP and attack. And then there are other monsters too, like Tyrannus scales to both defense and attack, but Belenus only scales to attack, even though he's a defense type monster. So it is really important to understand how your monster scales, and that's going to help you decide which stats you're looking for. Now, once you understand the scaling, and once you know what kind of build you're looking for, that's going to help guide you to what stats you want to make. And from there, a lot of it comes down to your stage of game and your rune quality. Now, the stage of game, it's not really about like, are you mid game, are you early game? In this context, what I actually mean is more like, who are your opponents? Are you fighting Conqueror 3? Are you fighting Fighter 3 guilds? Are you fighting G3 guilds? Or G2 or G1 or Conqueror 1, whatever. As you're fighting the enemy guilds, they should all be at about the same stage of game as you. So when you're trying to figure out what speed you want for a monster, is it a monster that you need to outspeed? Well, for me, if I'm fighting in G3 Siege, I feel like if I'm going in with less than 310, 315 speed against an enemy team with a speed lead that's showing speed, I'm probably not going to be fast enough, and I won't try it. But when I was in Guardian 1, if I had 275 speed, I usually felt like I was fast enough. Not always, depending on the monster, but usually I did. So it just depends, like, how fast do you think your opponents are? Now, if you don't know how fast your opponents are, go look at your guildie's defenses. Because if you're in a Guardian 1 guild, and your opponents are in a Guardian 1 guild, then everybody's probably all about the same. So if you see most of your guildies Orions are about 285, then you can figure the enemy's Orions are probably usually going to be about the same, and what you need to be is about 290, 295 to comfortably outspeed, assuming you have the same speed lead, like a Susano Orion. So if your guildies are all at plus 20k HP and plus 400 defense, then that's about your target. Maybe you could have a little less HP and a little more defense, or vice versa, but that's about your target if that's what's working. So then you ask yourself, instead of saying, how fast does this monster need to be, you say, what's the fastest I can make this monster while still getting 20k HP, 400 defense, 59 resistance, 40 accuracy, 85 crit rate, whatever other target stats you have. And then, once you get to that build, you say, okay, now if I want to keep all these stats, and I want to do a crit damage rune, how much more do I have to slow the monster down? Because ultimately, every single stat, when you think about it like this, every single stat on every single rune is basically a stat that could be anything else. Like at this stage of the game, especially if you've been playing Summoner's War for a while, you're going to have so many runes. You're going to have so many runes in your box. I mean, I've got, I think, over 2,000 runes on my account right now. And every single rune is a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, right? So if I go look at my Violent slot 1s, I've got all these runes just in slot 1. And I look at my slot 2s, and I've got all these runes in slot 2, and on and on and on. So when I need to make stats on a monster, it honestly doesn't matter. Do I use a speed slot 2 with lots of HP subs and then a bunch of slow runes? Do I use an HP slot 2 with high speed subs and a bunch of fast runes? I get there either way. It's all about putting the pieces of the puzzle together. But at the end of the day, you can only get so many stats. Each stat on each rune represents basically part of a role. Let's say you drop this will rune right here. Good or bad, I'm just picking something from my farming. This rune right now, this is a hero with innate. Now the best possible starting rune you can have is a legend with innate. So on this rune, we have 6% attack. This is 75% of the maximum roll. Attack can roll between 5 and 8. So it's 75% of the maximum roll. Even though it's a low roll, if you think about I can have 8% attack, it's 75% of a roll. You don't think about it as low or high, you just think about it as how much of the maximum possible stats. The resistance, again, resistance can roll 4 to 8, but it doesn't matter that it's super low. This is 62% of the maximum roll. So when I put all these together here, I've got one roll from the speed, and then I've got about a roll and a quarter from these 2 stats, about 2 rolls really from these 3 stats put together. So I've got 3 rolls on this rune, the roll being like a maximum amount of stats that I can get. Now a perfect starting rune, Legend with Innate, would have 5 rolls. That would be a maximum attack innate, and then 4 maximum, or maximum any stat innate, and then 4 maximum subs. If everything on that rune rolls perfectly, like it just rolls max, you start with 5 max stats, 5 max rolls, and then you roll 4 more times, that's 9 rolls. And if it happens to be a rune that can have 4 grindable subs, you can add an additional 30% in stats, which is about 3.75 rolls, and then you can add another 5 speed, which is a little less than 1 roll. So you can basically add another 4.5 rolls. You can get about 13.5 rolls of stats, but that's like a once ever in a lifetime rune that none of us really have. A realistic expectation, like a realistic expectation of the best runes you're likely to see. I mean, if you look at my account right here, and we just go to the runes and we look at the single most efficient rune on my account, we can see that my most efficient rune is 124% efficiency. Now, I'm not going to do a whole thing on efficiency in this video, but basically 9 max rolls is 100%, and then each roll after that is 7%, or each roll before that is about 7%. So what that means is this rune has about 12.5 rolls of stats. So the single best rune on my account is still missing an entire roll worth of stats from a perfect rune. And you can see I've only got 2 at this level. I've got 1 more that's got about 12 rolls. And by the time we get down to my 10th rune, I'm already down to 11 rolls. So for most of us, and I have really high rune quality, so for most of us, getting more than 10 or 11 rolls, you're only going to have 1 or 2 of those runes on your account. So if you think about stats in their totality and how many stats can you put on a monster, an extremely well-runed monster will be about 100% efficiency. A really late-game monster, when you get into endgame, like my highest monster right now is 110% efficiency. But for most of us, 100% efficiency is about the time that we're reaching Guardian. So what that means is you have 6 runes with 9 rolls each. That's 48 rolls. Whatever the stats come from those 48 rolls, that's how many stats you can put on your monster. If your monster has 200 speed additional on it, that 200 speed is going to represent about 35 rolls, which means you only have 13 other rolls total for stats. If you then also want to give it 100 crit rate, which is 85 added crit rate, that's another 12 rolls. Guess what? Your monster has no stats except for speed and crit rate, because that's a 100% efficiency monster. A 300 speed monster with 100 crit rate at 100% efficiency literally has 0 other stats. It's not even actually possible because you have to have 4 different stats on each rune, but just for the example. So that's where the value of crit rate and accuracy and even resistance runes comes in, is it's a way to reach those other stat thresholds without eating up all the roll value. And then when you're giving up things like crit damage in lieu of crit rate, you make up the crit damage with artifacts, and that's one of the big changes that artifacts have made to the game. But in our earlier example, when we're talking about how do you build this monster, well, you figure out, let's say you're an earlier stage of game and you're an 80% efficiency player. Well, one thing is the math on efficiency, it works backwards, not forwards. So if you're an 80% efficiency player, it actually means that you have about 6 rolls on each rune, or you have about 36 total rolls of stats. So if you're trying to add 100 speed to your monster, that's going to be about 16 rolls, which means you only have about 20 other rolls of stats to make your crit rate, your crit damage, your attack, your accuracy, and so forth. And so it's all on a sliding scale. The more rolls of stats you dedicate to speed, the more rolls of stats you take away from other potential stats. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, because every monster should be built differently. A Daphnis needs all of his rolls to go into attack, crit rate, crit damage, accuracy, and yes, speed. A monster like Lucian does not need the speed, and that's why they can hit so much harder, because all he needs is attack, crit rate, and crit damage, unless you're building him swift, and then you do need some speed. But, you know, if you're running like a Leo Lucian or a Taeon Lucian, like just a fat Lucian, all he needs, literally all his rolls are going attack, crit rate, crit damage. That's it. So Lucian is going to be your prime example of the hardest hitter you can make. Whereas a monster like Okeanos, who was the meta, right? We're giving up a lot of attack on him, and we're getting that attack back on artifacts, and instead we're putting all of our rolls into speed, accuracy, with some crit rate, attack, and tankiness stats, but the focus of our roll value is going into that speed and that accuracy, or we're using the slot 6 accuracy to offset one way or the other. So to tie this all back together to where we were starting with, when you're figuring out how you want to build your monster, you want to figure out the importance of the stats. Remember, the first thing I said is you're going to prioritize. So when I build Chung Peng, I'm going to say, first and foremost, the most important thing to me and the way I use him is going to be that he lands his strip. So accuracy is actually the most important stat for me on my Chung Peng. Second, I'm going to care about speed tuning, not speed. I don't actually usually run my Chung Peng to be like super fast, because he doesn't attack bar manipulate. Now, if you're talking about for RTA purposes, people will usually run Chung with 2 or 3 other strippers, and at least one of them will do an attack bar manipulation, and all of the other strippers will actually act in front of Chung. But if you're running Chung as your one and only stripper, like in field content, you have to recognize that he's one of the few strippers in the game that does not do any kind of attack bar manipulation with his strip skill. Now, he does attack bar manipulate. I said a moment ago he doesn't, but he does it on a different skill. On the skill that actually strips, which is the skill that sets up the other monsters on your team, there's no pushback, there's no attack bar booster. So I need all of my monsters speed tuned together closely in order to make sure that I don't get cut. So when I run my Chung, I don't want him at 300 speed and my next monster at 260, because then the enemy team will just go in between and they'll cleanse. So I'm going to intentionally run him at a closer speed to my other monsters, which means Violent becomes a much more possible build for me. So, knowing that I'm going to run him Violent, knowing that I want to speed tune him with my other builds, I go into the optimizer and I say, who am I going to run him with? Well, let's just, for example, say Poseidon, because we talked about Poseidon earlier. Well, Poseidon is amazing. Chung strips, Poseidon takes everybody's attack bar away and does big damage, and then adds a slow, so then Chung's going to get back in front of them, he's going to strip them again a second time, he's going to push their attack bar back a second time and reset their skills. So my Poseidon is already ruined at 231. Now there's a question here, do I want to re-rune Poseidon, or do I like his build where it is? If I like his build where it is, then I want my Chung to be between 231 and 235. I want him to be right near where my Poseidon is. So knowing, as I do on my own account, about how many total stats I can add, that gives me parameters. And then I say, well, I don't need Chung to be in a major offensive dealing build, because Poseidon is the damage dealer. So my Chung needs to have accuracy, he needs to have about 235 speed, and then from there I can allocate the remaining stats between HP, defense, attack, crit rate, crit damage, based on whatever build I want. I tend to build my Chung Peng a little bit tankier, because he's not meant to do as much damage. And so you can see this is the build that I have him in. RTA build is actually pretty similar to this, just 85 crit rate in RTA, and he's on will runes, of course. But the overall stats are actually pretty similar. I think he has a bit more attack as well. RTA, we tend to give our higher quality runes to monsters that we use more. I don't use Chung as much outside. But this is the same context, the same type of build that I use Chung in. So, that's a lot of info for one video. Hopefully I was able to get the point across, but we're definitely going to stop there. This is a really long video. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, please remember to turn that like button blue. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe to the channel as well. It obviously helps the creators out, helps our channels grow. And on that note, guys, I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.